Jumping in here, Kinesiology 230, Chapter 6, Presentation number 2, Cardiovascular Responses. Let's get going. So with this, like I did before, I'm just going to highlight the one we're going to talk about here. This will be cardiovascular responses to aerobic exercise training. This is the acute side of the equation, meaning short-term responses. Now, the book does a pretty good job here of putting together a table for your reference in terms of heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac. But what I want to point out is, much like we're talking about in the next couple presentations, they break it out into cardiovascular, respiratory, metabolic, and endocrine, which makes life a lot easier. You can follow along in Table 6.1 in the book if you so choose while I'm doing these presentations, or just kind of follow along and go back to 6.1 at your leisure. So let's go ahead and jump into these. So the two main components you have of the cardiovascular system, well, we've talked a lot about these already, are the heart, which is the cardiac side, and the vascular, which is or are the blood vessels. Now note, this is different than the cardiorespiratory system, which includes the lungs. So the cardiovascular is the heart and the vascular, cardiovascular, and cardiorespiratory, respiration, would be the heart, lungs, as well as the vascular system. So, it's a case where you're looking at layering in different components, and you just have to pay attention to the nuance of the terminology. So exercise, it stimulates the heart to supply blood to the muscles. We see this on this sympathetic side of the equation, where the fight or flight response by the SNS picks up the fact that we're doing a workout, and that workout itself increases the fight or flight response. So it upregulates the SNS and it downregulates the PNS, the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's this upregulation that causes some of the simple early adaptations that we see in exercise. Increased blood flow, increased stroke volume, these types of things that we see because your body is sending a signal that we need to redirect and shunt blood flow to be able to meet the demands of what will be the muscles working or going from rest to a worked environment. Now, the vascular system is dynamic. And we talked a little bit about this in one of the other presentations in Chapter 2. It has the ability to dilate, meaning expand, and also constrict and contract as demand changes. And this is within certain tolerances. It's not like it's going to expand and contract itty bitty. I mean, there's a little bit of limitation to this, or there is a limitation to this. But it does have a direct effect on the total peripheral resistance. And when you have a dilation in the system, it opens up the pipes to allow more flow of blood. And then when you look at the equations that you see with pressure, volume, and temperature, right? As pressure goes up, volume and temperature will change, right? As pressure goes down, volume and temperature will change, meaning when you look at the equation itself, if we keep volume the same and pressure goes up, that means temperature goes up. If we look at volume and keep that the same, as pressure goes down, temperature will go down. And if we keep pressure the same, if we keep the pipes the same size and we increase the volume of blood going through them, well, that's going to increase the pressure on them. And you see that when you have people who have high blood pressure. Their pipes, meaning their vascular system, can't adapt to the increased blood flow that they see, even in the day-to-day activities of daily living, let alone activities of working out. And so as a result, it's the same amount of blood flow that they need to service their body, but because they've lost the elasticity in the system, it increases the overall pressure. And that's represented, if you remember, S over D. You'll see an increase in the resting blood pressure of people who have lost that elasticity. So now, if we look at the write-ups, and I talked about those earlier, you'll look at the two different systems, one of which is the pipe system in the house, and the other is like the way the river system works and goes out to the delta, and you have the flow of water in the delta. It's very similar in the body in terms of capillary action versus blood flow from the aorta, which is at a high pressure, down to a low pressure environment, like the capillary system. But the effect of a nervous system itself, when you start moving, it creates the SNS response of that fight or flight, and it causes the heart rate to go up and the stroke volume to also increase. And this increases the amount of blood that flows to service the body. This is written by the term of a Q with a little dot on top of it. So cardiac output is Q. The Frank-Starling mechanism states that the stroke volume of the heart increases proportionally to the volume of blood filling the heart. So you have to think this through in terms of, we send blood out on the red line, comes back on the blue line, and we haven't really had an uptick of work per se at the heart level, at the cardiac level, but we start moving the body, and by moving the body, whatever that activity may be, that causes a response of moving blood through the system. That blood gets moved through the system and increases flow back to the heart. The heart feels that, and the Frank-Starling mechanism states that as that blood flow increases, that's coming back to the heart, what's happening is you have a greater amount of volume coming back because the heart is filling faster because of the blood flow that's coming back, and that's going to trigger that Frank-Starling mechanism, and then that triggers a series of events that increases, SA node firing, AV node, the Purkinje fibers, and you have an increase of blood flow that happens from a contractile side. But the first part of it is from the response of articulation of the joints and the muscles moving. And so it's the increased movement associated with the activity that causes the increased blood volume back to the heart. That's what triggers the Frank-Starling mechanism. So with blood pressure on the acute response side, the amount of pressure on the exerted on the walls of the arterial system changes. And when the ventricle is depolarized, if you remember the QRS, that's when the pressure is the highest, denoted by 126 here. And when in between ventricular depolarization, the pressure is the lowest. That's represented by the 70 here. We talked about that at length in our previous presentations, and we talked about systolic over diastolic. And you have S over D, that's S is the 126, the D diastolic is 70, and it's written by S over D, or higher over lower. And during aerobic exercise, there's a linear increase within the workout itself between the workload and time, and how systolic blood pressure goes up in proportion to the intensity of the exercise. The greater the intensity of the exercise, the more the systolic will increase. Now the diastolic, and we talked about it before, that stays pretty much the same, right? So your in-between beats will stay pretty much the same. Now, I will say this, you have just a side note here that they have in the book, and I think you see it somewhere else in one of the test questions. The increase in blood pressure also increases the blood flow, right? So we know that you have greater push coming out of the heart. So, and you also have more beats per minute when a person is exercising. So you have increased blood flow that's happening, cardiac output that's happening while a person's working out. Now, this causes an increase in the hematocrit side, and that hematocrit side is or are the red blood cells, and those are the ones that carry the oxygen. Those are the ones that carry the four tops in their car to their show. And so as a result, what happens is the blood plasma volume drops, the hematocrit jumps up, and you're able to carry more blood while the heart is pumping more blood, and it's also pumping more blood in terms of beats per minute. So you have a couple different mechanisms that are going on that are kind of like a domino effect as a result of that Frank-Starling, where the heart figures out that there's more blood coming to it. So we need to now start a series of events to increase hematocrit levels, to have more oxygen, to service the muscles, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a pretty cool little series of events that happen. And it's of course, it's the human body, so it's incredibly complex. But in terms of just kind of keeping it simple for our class and understanding that there's a domino effect that allows for a greater amount of stroke volume, and there's also a greater amount of beats per minute that happen when a person starts in an acute setting, when a person starts their workout. All right, guys, I'm going to jump out of this and go into the next presentation.